Uh, Hi everyone. I'm back with the next reading of The Blue Castle. I apologize for it taking so long. I've just been swamped with work and my editors, God love them, they work so hard. But anyway, I'm back for another reading and I hope you enjoy it. And I'm looking forward to any comments that you have. That's part of why I'm doing this. I just would like other feedback on the book, commentary. Whatever you have to say, I'd love to read it. So, we are back at chapter 7 now, and Valancy has found out that she's waiting to find out about her heart, and the doctor's taken off, and she's feeling very defeated, I feel. So, here we go. There was a rose bush on the little Sterling lawn growing beside the gate. It was called Doss's rose bush. Cousin Georgina had given it to Valancy 5 years ago, and Valancy had planted it joyfully. She loved roses. But, of course, the rose bush never bloomed. That was her luck. Valancy did everything she could think of and took the advice of everybody in the clan. But still the rose bush would not bloom. It throve and grew luxuriantly, with great leafy branches untouched of rust or spider, but not even a bud had ever appeared on it. Valancy, looking at it 2 days after her birthday, was filled with a sudden, overwhelming hatred for it. The thing wouldn't bloom. Very well, then, she would cut it down. She marched to the tool room in the barn for her garden knife, and she went at the rosebush viciously. A few minutes later, horrified, Miss Frederick came out to the veranda and beheld her daughter slashing insanely among the rosebush boughs. Half of them were already strewn on the walk. The bush looked sadly dismantled. "Doss, what on earth are you doing? Have you gone crazy?" "No," said Valancy. She meant to say it defiantly, but habit was too strong for her. She said it deprecatingly. I've just made up my mind to cut this bush down. It is no good. It never blooms, and it never will bloom." "That's no reason for destroying it," said Miss Frederick sternly. "It was a beautiful bush, quite ornamental. You have made a sorry-looking thing of it." "Rose trees should bloom," said Valancy, a little obstinately. "Don't argue with me, Doss. Clear up that mess and leave the bush alone. I don't know what Georgina will say when she sees how you hacked it to pieces. Really, I'm surprised at you. And to do it without consulting me. Oh, my God. As far as the world didn't stop." "The bush is mine," muttered Valancy under her breath. "What's that? What did you say, Doss?" "I only said the bush was mine," repeated Valancy humbly. Miss Frederick turned without a word and marched back into the house. The mischief was done now. Valancy knew she had offended her mother deeply and would not be spoken to or noticed in any way for 2 or 3 days. Cousin Stickles would see to Valancy's bringing up, but Miss Frederick would preserve the stony silence of outraged majesty. Sounds like she's got a stick up her back. Valancy sighed and put away her garden knife, hanging it precisely on its precise nail in the tool shop. She cleared away the several branches and swept up the leaves. Her lips twitched as she looked at the straggling bush. It had an odd resemblance to its shrunken, scrawny donor, little cousin Georgina herself. "I certainly have made an awful-looking thing of it," thought Valancy. But she did not feel repentant, only sorry she had offended her mother. Things would be so uncomfortable until she was forgiven. Miss Frederick was one of those women who can make their anger felt all over the house, walls and doors, and no protection from it. "You better go uptown and get the mail," said Cousin Stickles, when Valancy went in. "I can't go. I feel all sorter peaky and piney this morning. I want you to stop at the drugstore and get me a bottle of Redfern's blood bitters. There's nothing like Redfern's bitters for building the body up. Cousin James says the purple pills are best, but I know better. My poor dear husband took Redfern bitters right up to the day he died. Doesn't sound like they did very much. Don't let them charge you more than 90 cents. I can get them for that at the port. What have you been saying to your poor mother? Do you ever stop to think, Doss, that you can only have one mother?" "One is more than enough for me," thought Valancy undutifully as she went upstairs. She got Cousin Stickles' bottle of bitters, and then she went to the post office and asked for her mail at the general delivery. Her mother did not have a box. They got too little mail to bother with it. Valancy did not expect any mail, except maybe the Christian Times, which was the only paper they took. They hardly got any letters, but Valancy rather liked to stand in the office and watch Mr. Carew, the gray-bearded Santa Clausy old clerk, handing out letters to the lucky people who did get them. He did it with such a detached, impersonal, Jove-like air, as if it did not matter in the least to him what supernatural joys or shattering horrors might be in the letters for the people to whom they were addressed. Letters had a fascination for Valancy, perhaps because she so seldom got any. In her blue castle, exciting epistles, bound with silk and sealed with crimson, were always being brought to her by pages in livery of gold and blue, but in real life her only letters were occasional perfunctory notes from relatives or an advertising circular. Consequently, she was immensely surprised when Mr. Carew, looking even more Jovian than usual, poked a letter out to her. Yes, it was addressed to her plainly in a fierce black hand. Miss Valancy Sterling, Elm Street, Deerwood, and the postmark was Montreal. Valancy picked it up with a little quickening of her breath. Montreal! It must be from Dr. Trent. He had remembered her after all. Valancy met Uncle Benjamin coming in as she was going out. I was glad the letter was safely in her bag. "What," said Uncle Benjamin, "is the difference between a donkey and a postage stamp?" "I don't know. What?" answered Valancy dutifully. "One you lick with a stick, and the other you stick with a lick. Ha ha! How amusing." Uncle Benjamin passed in tremendously pleased with himself. He's not very smart, I don't think. Cousin Stickles pounced on the Times when Valancy got home, but it did not occur to ask if there were any letters. Miss Frederick would have asked it, but Miss Frederick's lips at present were sealed. Valancy was glad of this. If her mother had asked if there were any letters, Valancy would have had to admit there was. Then she would have had to let her mother and Cousin Stickles read the letter, and all would be discovered. Her heart acted strangely on the way upstairs, and she sat down by her window for a few minutes before opening her letter. She felt very guilty and deceitful. She had never before kept a letter secret from her mother. Every letter she had ever written or received had been read by Mrs. Frederick. That had never mattered before. Valancy had never had anything to hide. But this did matter. She could not have anyone see this letter, but her fingers trembled with the consciousness of wickedness and unfilial conduct as she opened it. She trembled a little, too, perhaps with apprehension. She felt quite sure there was nothing seriously wrong with her heart, but one never knew. But Dr. Trent's letter was like himself, blunt, abrupt, concise, wasting no words. Dr. Trent never beat about the bush. "Dear Miss Sterling," and then a page of black, positive writing. Valancy seemed to read it at a glance, and then she dropped the letter on her lap. Her face turned ghost white. Dr. Trent told her that she had a very dangerous and fatal form of heart disease, angina pectoris, which evidently complicated with aneurysm, whatever that was, and it was in its last stages. He said that, without mincing matters, that nothing could be done for her. If she took great care of herself, she might live a year, but she might also die at any moment. Dr. Trent never troubled himself about euphemisms. She must be careful to avoid all excitement and severe muscular efforts. She must eat and drink moderately, and she must never run. She must never go upstairs and uphill with great care. Any sudden jolt or shock, oh, sorry, I read that incorrectly. She must never run. She must go upstairs and uphill with great care. Sorry. Any sudden jolt or shock might be fatal. She was to get the prescription he enclosed, fill it, and carry it with her always, taking a dose whenever her attacks came on. And he was hers very truly, H.B. Trent. Valancy sat for a long while by her window. Outside was a world drowned in the light of spring afternoon. Skies entrancingly blue, winds perfumed and free, lovely soft blue hazes at the end of every street. Over at the railway station, a group of young girls was waiting for a train, and she heard their gay laughter as they chattered and joked. The train roared in and roared out again, but none of these things had any reality. Nothing had any reality except the fact that she had only another year to live. When she was tired of sitting at the window, she went over and lay down on her bed, staring at the cracked, discolored ceiling. The curious numbness that follows on a staggering blow possessed her. She did not feel anything except a boundless surprise and incredulity, behind which was the conviction that Dr. Trent knew his business and that she, Valancy Sterling, who had never lived, was about to die. When the gong rang for supper, Valancy got up and went downstairs mechanically, from a force of habit. She wondered that she had been let alone for so long, but of course her mother would not pay any attention to her just now. Valancy was thankful for this. He thought the quarrel over the rosebush had been really, as Miss Frederick herself might have said, providential. She could not eat anything, but both Miss Frederick and Cousin Stickles thought that was because she was deservedly unhappy over her mother's attitude, and her lack of appetite was not commented on. Delancey forced herself to swallow a cup of tea and then sat and watched the others eat, with an odd feeling that years had passed away since she had sat with them at the dinner table last. She found herself smiling inwardly to think what a commotion she could make if she chose. Let her merely tell them what was in Dr. Trent's letter, and there would be so much fuss made of it, Delancey thought bitterly. They really care as if they really cared about her. Dr. Trent's housekeeper got word for him today, said Cousin Stickles, so suddenly that Valancy jumped guiltily. Is there anything in Thoughtways? Miss Judd was talking to her uptown. They think that his son will recover, but Dr. Trent wrote that if he did, he was going to take him abroad as soon as he was able to travel, and wouldn't be back here for a year at least. That will not matter much to us, said Miss Fredericks majestically. He is not our doctor. I would not. Here she looked, or seemed to look, accusingly right through Valancy. Have him to doctor a sick cat. May I go upstairs and lie down? Said Valancy faintly. I have a headache. What has given you a headache? Asked Cousin Stickles, since Miss Frederick would not. The question has to be asked. Valancy could not be allowed to have headaches without any interference. You ain't in the habit of having headaches. I hope you're not taking the mumps. Here, try a spoonful of vinegar. What kind of treatment is vinegar supposed to do for you? Piffle, said Valancy rudely, getting up from the table. She did not care just then if she were rude. She had had it to be polite all her life. If it had been possible for Cousin Stickles to turn pale, she would have. As it was not, she turned yellower, and that must have been attractive. Are you sure you ain't feverish, Doss? You sound ill. You go and get right into your bed, said Cousin Stickles, thoroughly alarmed, and I'll come up and rub your forehead and the back of your neck with red fern's liniment. Delancey had reached the door, but she turned. I won't be rubbed with red fern's liniment, she said. Cousin Stickles stared and gasped. What do you mean? I won't be rubbed with red fern's liniment, repeated Valancy. Horrid sticky stuff, and it has the vilest smell of any liniment I ever saw. It's no good, and I want to be left alone. That's all. Valancy went out, leaving Cousin Stickles aghast. Cousin Stickles aghast. Now that must be a wonderful sight. She's feverish. She must be feverish, ejaculated Cousin Stickles. Miss Frederick went on eating her supper. It did not matter whether Valancy was or was not feverish. Valancy had been guilty of impertinence to her. Okay, I think we have time to do one more chapter, and then I have to get back to work. So this is chapter 8. Valancy did not sleep that night. She lay awake all through the long, dark hours, thinking and thinking. She made a discovery that surprised her. She, who had been afraid of almost everything in her life, was not afraid of death. It did not seem in the least terrible to her, and she need not be afraid of anything else. Why had she been afraid of things anyway? Because of life, afraid of Uncle Benjamin, because of the menace of poverty and old age? But now she would never be old, neglected, tolerated, afraid of being an old maid all her life. But now she would not be an old maid very long. She'd always been afraid of offending her mother and her clan because she had to live with and among them, and couldn't live peacefully if she didn't give in to them. But now she hadn't. Delancey felt a curious freedom. But she was still horribly afraid of one thing: the fuss the whole jam fry, there's a word, jam fry, the whole jam fry of them would make when she told them. Delancey shuddered at the thought of it. She couldn't endure it. Oh, she knew so well how it would be. First there would be indignation. Yes, indignation on the part of Uncle James because she had gone to a doctor, any doctor, without consulting him first. Indignation on the part of her mother for being so sly and deceitful. To your own mother, Doss. Indignation on the part of the whole clan because she had not gone to Dr. Marsh. Oh, no. Then would come the solicitude. She would be taken to Dr. Marsh. When Dr. Marsh confirmed Dr. Trent's diagnosis, she would be taken to specialists in Toronto and Montreal. Uncle Benjamin would foot the bill with a splendid gesture of magnificence, in thus assisting the widow and orphan, and talk forever of the shocking fee specialists charged for looking wise and saying they couldn't do anything. When a specialist could do nothing for her, Uncle James would insist on her taking purple pills. I've known them to effect a cure when all the doctors had given up. And her mother would insist on Redfern's blood bitters, and Cousin Stickles would insist on rubbing her over the heart every night with Redfern's liniment, on the grounds that it might do good and couldn't do any harm. Yeah, right. Do you ever see what's in all those old liniments? It's not really safe. And everybody else would have some pet cure for her to take. Dr. Stalling would come to her and say solemnly, "You are very ill. Are you prepared for what may be before you?" Almost as if he were going to shake his forefinger at her. The forefinger, it had not grown any shorter or less knobbly with age, and she would be watched and checked on like a baby, and never let to do anything or go anywhere alone. Perhaps she would not even be allowed to sleep alone, lest she die in her sleep. Cousin Stickles or her mother would insist on sharing her room and bed. Yes, undoubtedly they would. What a way to spend your last days, with Cousin Stickles in your bed. Wonderful. It was this last thought that really decided Valancy. She could not put up with it, and she wouldn't. As the clock in the hall below struck 12, Valancy suddenly and defiantly made up her mind that she would not tell anybody. She had always been told, ever since she could remember, that she must hide her feelings. "It is not ladylike to have feelings," Cousin Stickles had once told her disapprovingly. Well, she would hide them with a vengeance. But though she was not afraid of death, she was not indifferent to it. She found that she resented it. It was not fair that she should have to die when she had never lived. Rebellion flamed up in her soul as the dark hours passed by. Not because she had no future, but because she had no past. "I'm poor, I'm ugly, I'm a failure, and I'm near death," she thought. She could see her own obituary notice in the Deerwood Weekly Times, copied into the Port Lawrence Journal. A deep gloom was cast over Deerwood, etc., etc. These a large circle of friends to mourn, etc., etc., etc. Those were lies, all lies. Gloom, forsooth. Nobody would miss her. Her death would not matter a straw to anybody. Not even her mother loved her. Her mother, who had been so disappointed that she was not a boy, or at least a pretty girl. Valancy reviewed her whole life between midnight and the early spring dawn. It was a very drab existence, but here and there an incident loomed out with a significance out of all proportion to its real importance. Those incidents were all unpleasant in one way or another. Nothing really pleasant had ever happened to Valancy. "I've never even had one whole happy hour in my life. Not one," she thought. I've just been I've just been a colorless nonentity. I remember reading somewhere once that there is an hour in which a woman might be happy all her life, if she could but find it. I've never found my hour. Never. And I never ever will now. If I could only have had that hour, I'd be willing to die. Those significant incidents kept bobbing up in her mind like unbidden ghosts, without any sequence or time or place. For instance, that time when, at 16, she had blued a tubful of clothes too deeply, and the time when, at 8, she had stolen some raspberry jam from Aunt Wellington's pantry. Valancy never heard the last of those two misdemeanors. At almost every clan gathering they were raked up against her as jokes. Uncle Benjamin hardly ever missed retelling the raspberry jam incident. He had been the one to catch her, her face all stained and streaked. "I have really done so few bad things that they have to keep harping on the old ones," thought Valancy. "Why, I've never even had a quarrel with anyone. I haven't an enemy. What a spineless thing I must be to not even have ever made one enemy." There was the incident of the dust piles at school, when she was 7. Valancy always recalled it when Dr. Stalling referred to the text, "To him that hath shall be given, and from him that hath not shall be taken every that which he hath." There's a lot of haths in there. Other people might puzzle over that text, but it never puzzled Valancy. The whole relationship between herself and Olive, dating from the day of the dust pile, was a commentary on it. She'd been going to school for about a year, but Olive, who was a year younger, had just begun and had about her the glamour of a new girl, and an exceedingly pretty girl at that. It was at recess, and all the girls, big and little, were out on the road in front of the school making dust piles. Kids must have had not much going on back then, if that's what they did for fun. The aim of each girl was to have the biggest pile. Valancy was good at making dust piles. There was an art to it, and she had secret hopes of leading, but Olive, working off by herself, was suddenly discovered to have a larger dust pile than anybody else. Valancy felt no jealousy. Her dust pile was quite big enough to please her. Then one of the older girls had an inspiration. "Let's put all our dust in Olive's pile and make a tremendous one," she exclaimed. The frenzy seemed to seize the girls. They swooped down on the dust piles with pails and shovels. In a few seconds, Olive's pile was a veritable pyramid. In vain, Valancy, with her scrawny, outstretched little arms, tried to protect her pile. She was ruthlessly swept aside, her dust pile scooped up and poured on Olive's. Valancy turned away resolutely and began building another dust pile. Again, a bigger girl pounced on it. Valancy stood before it, flushed and indignant, her arms outspread. "Don't take it," she pleaded. "Please don't take it." "But why?" demanded the older girl. "Why won't you help build Olive's bigger?" "I want my own little dust pile," said Valancy piteously. Her pleas went unheeded. While she argued with one girl, another scraped up her dust pile, and Valancy turned away, her heart swelling, her eyes full of tears. "Jealous, you're just jealous," said the other girls mockingly. "You were very selfish," said her mother coldly when Valancy told her about it that night. That was the first and last time Valancy had ever taken any of her troubles to her mother. Valancy was neither jealous nor selfish. It was only that she wanted a dust pile of her own, small or big, it didn't matter. A team of horses came down the street, and Olive's dust pile was scattered over the roadway. The bell rang, and the girls trooped into school and had forgotten the whole affair before they reached their seats. But Valancy never forgot it. To this day, she resented it in her secret soul. But was it not symbolic of her whole life? "I've never been able to have my own dust pile," thought Valancy. The enormous red moon she'd seen rising right at the end of the street one autumn evening of her 6th year. She'd been sick and cold with the awful, uncanny horror of it. It was so near and so big. She had run in trembling to her mother, and her mother had laughed at her. She had gone to bed and hidden her face under the clothes in terror lest she might look at the window and see the horrible moon glaring at her through it. The boy who had tried to kiss her at a party when she was 15, she had not let him. She had evaded him and run. He was the only boy who had ever tried to kiss her. Now, 14 years later, Valancy found herself wishing that she had let him. The time she'd been made to apologize to Olive for something she hadn't done. Olive had said that Valancy had pushed her into the mud and spoiled her new shoes on purpose. Valancy knew she hadn't. It had been an accident, and even that wasn't her fault, but nobody would believe her. She had to apologize and kiss Olive to make up. The injustice of it burned in her soul tonight. That summer when Olive had the most beautiful hat trimmed with creamy yellow net with a wreath of red roses on it and little ribbon bows under the chin. Valancy had wanted a hat like that more than she had ever wanted anything. She pleaded for one and had been laughed at all summer because she had to wear a horrid little brown sailor hat with elastic that cut behind her ears. None of the girls would go around with her because she was so shabby. Nobody but Olive. Perhaps she thought people had always thought that Olive so sweet and unselfish. I was an excellent foil for her, thought Valancy. Even then she knew that. Valancy had tried to win a prize for attendance in Sunday school once, but Olive won it. There were so many Sundays Valancy had to stay at home because she had colds. She had once tried to say a piece in school one Friday afternoon and had broken down on it. Olive was a good reciter, and she never got stuck. The night she had spent in Port Lawrence with Aunt Isabel when she was 10. Brian Sterling was there from Montreal. He was 12 years old, conceited, and clever. At family prayers in the morning, Brian had reached across and given Valancy's thin arm such a savage pinch that she screamed out in pain. After prayers were over, she was summoned to Aunt Isabel's bar of judgment. But when she said Byron had pinched her, Brian denied it. He said she cried out because the kitten scratched her. He said she had put the kitten up on her chair and was playing with it when she should have been listening to Uncle David's prayer. He was believed. In the Sterling clan, the boys were always believed before the girls. Great. Valancy was sent home in disgrace because of her exceedingly bad behavior during family prayers, and she was not asked to Aunt Isabel's again for many moons. She probably didn't care. The time Valancy's cousin Betty Sterling was married, somehow Valancy got wind of the fact that Betty was going to ask her to be one of her bridesmaids. Valancy was secretly uplifted. It would be a delightful thing to be a bridesmaid, and of course, she would have to have a new dress for it. A pretty new dress, a pink dress. Betty wanted all her bridesmaids to dress in pink. But Betty had never asked her after all. Valancy couldn't guess why, but long after her secret tears of disappointment had been dried, Olive told her. Betty, after much consultation and reflection, had decided that Valancy was too insignificant, and she would spoil the effect. That was 9 years ago. But tonight Valancy caught her breath with the old pain and sting of it. That day of her 11th year, when her mother had badgered her into confessing something she had never done, Valancy denied it for a long time, but eventually, for peace's sake, she had given in and pleaded guilty. Miss Frederick was always making people lie by pushing them to situations where they had to lie. Then her mother had made her kneel down on the parlor floor between herself and Cousin Stickles and say, "Oh God, please forgive me for not speaking the truth." Valancy had said it, but as she rose from her knees, she muttered, "But oh God, you know I did speak the truth." Valancy had not Valancy had not then heard of Galileo, but her fate was similar to his. She was punished just as severely as if she hadn't confessed. In winter, she was sent to dancing school. Uncle James had decreed she should go, and paid for her lessons. How she had looked forward to it, and how she had hated it. She had never had a voluntary partner. The teacher always had to tell some boy to dance with her, and generally he had been sulky about it. Yet Valancy was a good dancer, as light on her feet as thistledown. Olive, who never lacked eager partners, was heavy. The affair of the button string. When she was 10, all of the girls in school had button strings. Olive had a very long one with a great many beautiful buttons. Valancy had one, but most of her buttons were very commonplace. But she had 6 beauties that had come off Grandmother Sterling's wedding gown, sparkling buttons of gold and glass, much more beautiful than any Olive had. Their possession conferred a certain distinction on Valancy. She knew every little girl in school envied her, and the exclusive possession of those beautiful buttons. When Olive saw them on the button string, she had looked at them narrowly, but said nothing. Then, the next day, Aunt Wellington had come up to Elm Street and told Miss Frederick that she thought Olive should have some of those buttons. Grandmother Sterling had been just as much Wellington's mother as Frederick's. Miss Frederick had agreed amiably. She could not afford to fall out with Aunt Wellington. Moreover, the matter was of no importance to her whatever. Aunt Wellington carried off 4 of the buttons, generously leaving 2 for Valancy. Valancy had torn these from her string and flung them on the floor. She had not yet learned that it was unladylike to have feelings, and had been sent supperless to bed for the exhibition. The night of Margaret Blunt's party, she had made such pathetic efforts to be pretty that night. Bob Walker was to be there, and 2 nights before, on the moonlit veranda of Uncle Herbert's cottage at Mistawis, Rob had really seemed attracted to her. At Margaret's party, Rob had never even asked her to dance. He didn't even seem to notice her at all. She was a wallflower as usual. That, of course, was years ago. People in Deerwood had long since given up inviting Valancy to dances. But to Valancy, its humiliation and disappointment were of the other day. Her face burned in the darkness as she recalled to herself sitting there with her pitifully crimped thin hair and her cheeks that she had pinched for an hour before coming in an effort to make them red. I guess back then they didn't have blush and makeup like they do now. All that came out was a wild story that Valancy Sterling was rouged, whatever that means, at Margaret Blunt's party. In those days in Deerwood, that was enough to wreck your character forever. It did not wreck Valancy's or even damage it. People knew she couldn't be fast if she tried. They were only laughing at her. I've had nothing but a second-hand existence, decided Valancy. All the great emotions of life passed me by. I've never even had a grief. And have I ever really loved anybody? Do I really even love my mother? No, I don't. And that's the truth, whether it is disgraceful or not. I don't love her. I've never loved her. What's worse, I don't even like her. So I don't know anything about any kind of love. My life has been empty, so empty. Nothing is worse than emptiness, nothing. Valancy ejaculated this last nothing aloud passionately. Then she moaned and stopped thinking about anything for a while. One of her attacks of pain had come on. When it was over, something had happened to Valancy. Perhaps the culmination of the process that had been going on in her mind ever since she had read Dr. Trent's letter. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, the wisest and most accursed hour on the clock, but sometimes it sets us free. I've been trying to please other people all my life and failed, she said. After this, I shall please myself. I shall never pretend anything again. I've breathed an atmosphere of fibs and pretenses and evasions all my life. What a luxury it will be to tell the truth. I may not be able to do much that I want to do, but I won't do another thing that I don't want to do. Mother can pout for weeks and I shan't worry over it. Despair is a free man. Hope is a slave. Valancy got up and dressed with a deepening of that curious sense of freedom. When she had finished with her hair and opened up the window, she hurled out the jar of potpourri over into the next lot. It smashed gloriously against the schoolgirl complexion on the old carriage shop. I'm sick of the fragrance of dead things, said Valancy. So that was the end of chapter 8, and we will move on to chapter 9 next time. Now, I will tell you, I have read this book before. The next chapters are actually pretty funny, especially when she goes to the family dinner. I find that part quite amusing. So I will get back to another reading next time. I have a few minutes free, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, had a great time, and like I said, please leave your comments, discussions. If you love my reading, if you hate it, just tell me. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks. Bye.